Rasa Office Hours with me, Rachel, and Melinda. Melinda, do you want to talk a little bit about what your day-to-day role is at Raza, what it is that you do, and it might also be helpful to talk about the sort of questions that you would like to answer or would be best to answer to get people sort of like ideas going.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a solutions engineer at Rasa, and I work on the customer success engineering team, which means I spend um, most of my days helping customers either directly on calls and meetings with their Rasa bots and technical problems that they're having with it, or questions about best practices that they have around using Rasa. Um, Help them out with deployments quite often. So most recently, I've answered a lot of questions about deployments. Not that that makes it my favorite, but it's important. Otherwise, no one can talk to your bot. And otherwise, I also work quite often on our demo bots and on our documentation. Um, but yeah, I'm open to any kinds of questions around Rasa usage or questions at least that they're not terribly in depth about Rasa's architecture and such things.
So feel free to ask your questions in the chat, and we will answer them. And something I was talking about with somebody earlier, also on the Raza team, was that because Raza isn't a cloud provider, right? Like we don't run your assistant for you, so you're going to have to do some sort of integration. So my question for you, Melinda, is just based on your, preferences and delight, if you had no restrictions on what integrations you could use, which I know a lot of corporate customers do, what would you use to deploy a Raza assistant, just based on what you prefer?
So recently, and I mean, I very frequently spin up mini deployments of bots for trainings and things. My go-to is to use a Google Cloud VM and an embedded Kubernetes cluster, and then to use our quick install script for Rasa X to spin up a Rasa X deployment, which then also gives me a Rasa open source deployment. So that's my go-to method right now. Sometimes I also use the Docker Compose quick install script, also on a Google Cloud VM. Those are kind of the two most straightforward ways to just get started.
Yeah, what's the difference between Docker Compose and the Kubernetes?
Oh, Kubernetes is Kubernetes is specifically for clusters, and it's really not just that it's Kubernetes. It's the quick install script is using Helm charts, which could also be OpenShift. It doesn't have to be Kubernetes. Where Docker Compose, you can run it on like a single server. It does not require a cluster to be run on. There's also something called Docker Swarm that I really haven't worked with very much, but that gives you some of those like duplication characteristics of a cluster. But yeah, both Kubernetes and Docker Compose at some level make use of containers. It's just how those containers are in communication with each other and what the API behind them is. That's the difference between the two.
So if I had my Raza server that was running the chat part and my action server that was running custom actions, could I still use Docker Compose?
Yep, you definitely could. So you could have, so you can spin up a Docker Compose deployment that includes as services in the Docker Compose file, both your action server and your Rasa open source deployment. And then they would automatically be in like the same network, and that would be the easiest way to have them talk to each other. However, regardless of the method you deploy Rasa open source and your action server with, you can still have them communicate with each other because they are using an HTTP API. You just need to make sure that they each have right ports open and the information they need to make that connection. But there's no restriction on where exactly they're deployed.
Right. So hopefully that gives people some ideas about deployment options. It looks like Omkar raised his hand. Maybe feel free to just type your questions. We don't have to call on you. Nick says, question. Ooh, how to get the user location and share the information based on location. Example, US, OP, company name, address, email ID, mobile, etc. I will just, before Melinda says anything, I would make sure that you were following appropriate practices around privacy. Go ahead, Melinda.
A very good point. Yeah. So if you want to gather information from your user, any kind of information, sometimes that information will already be available to you because of the channel that you've deployed your bot on. So like if your users are logged into some system that tells you who they are and where they're from, then obviously the most low effort way to gather that information is simply to go fetch it from wherever it is in a custom action. If you're trying to get it from the user textually, so like it's a user you don't know anything about them and you want them to tell you, then typically pieces of information like location or company or email would be entities. And for specifically very common entities that have regular patterns like emails, you can use Duckling Entity Extractor to extract them. For things that might be a little more customized, so like when you say location, if you're thinking of town names in a specific area, that might be something that you train custom entity for. But if it's going to be a full, actually, Rachel, for full addresses, what would your go-to
Duckling
be?
does addresses.
Yeah.
You may have to do some custom entities with Duckling, depending on like the specific parts of the address, but I'd probably go with Duckling.
I love Duckling. Seriously, I do.
I mean, you can write your own regexes if you have a strong desire to do regex entity extraction. Again, if there's a common pattern, but
yep,
Duckling will be faster.
I also really love that if you ping Duckling's like liveness endpoint, it comes back with quack. I discovered this the other day, and I was just like, that is charming.
That's cute. So hopefully that helped, Nix. Some additional information. OP means output. I will share to the distributor locations by using location. Oh, gotcha. So like, someone's like, hey, I need to find, just to slightly modify the example, I need to find the nearest restaurant, and then you want to know where they are. I would probably ask them, you know, like what town, what state, zip code maybe. And then they can choose to give you that information or not.
Right. Yeah, zip codes are honestly, that would be my go-to because of the reduction in error that comes with a number versus a textual like string.
All right. Another question from Deshant. I'm working on forms and the story, getting contradiction with rules where I want to add anything else to the utterance. Can you suggest a better way to do this? So it sounds like, so you've got forms and a story and rules, and the rules are being contradicted. So you're probably getting an error message about that when you try to train because of our sort of like automated checking. When you want to add additional stuff. You may have an answer to this, Melinda. I think I'd probably need more details to understand exactly what it is that's going wrong.
I mean, forms, maybe as a if you want to post additional information, but are you activating and deactivating your form using rules already, and the two rules are getting detected as contradictory, or are you using the old form policy and rules in combination? Because that would also change.
Oh, lead dishes, yeah. And I guess my sort of general advice would be to see how far you can get without the rules. Like just try removing rules and see if stuff still works.
Yeah, identify the one that broke it. Then you can figure it out.
Do an ablation study, yeah. Be fancy about it. It's just like removing stuff until it.
Yeah.
See what happens.
I will say with rules, something I ran into recently, just be very cognizant of is if you're using any featurized slots. So in Rasa 2.0, that's anything where influence conversation is true. Be careful about mentioning that in your rules. And if you want a rule to handle all cases where the slot is null, which I can imagine in a form situation, actually put the condition as the slot being null. That can help avoid contradictions as well, especially with stories which get processed like after rules effectively.
Null or none?
In YAML, it's null, but in Python, it would be none.
Oh, interesting.
I know, isn't that
I
fun?
don't think I've run into that before.
Yep.
So hopefully that helps, Deshant. And if you want to add additional information, we can circle back. Harris, sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, says, what's the best way to handle multiple values which belong to the same entity? For example, a user is an entity having multiple attributes, age and name, and those are slots as well. How do I write training data? Okay, so this is like an entity that has other things associated with it, like a hierarchical relationship within the entity.
Ah, so age and name as examples, I would not imagine being hierarchical, but certainly
Because
you
they'd be
can
associated with
have.
the user.
Oh, in that sense, right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually an interesting question because I know there's been some thought about having something equivalent to like a profile slot that can hold this kind of hierarchical information automatically. At the moment, what you can do is a slot, like a slot of type any, can hold really any information. So if you wanted to, for example, have a profile slot that is a dictionary and contains multiple of these this information that you got from entities, you could do that. You would just need to fill those slots. You would just need to fill the parts of that slot in a custom action as opposed to having it be mapped one-to-one slot name to entity name, because then the names have to be identical. Yeah, I think Rachel's brought up patience very relevant here. So there's something about if you have entities that are like really related to each other. So like in the example here with cities, if you have the same kind of value, so they're both city names, but they're playing different roles in the sentence, like here it's destination and origin, then you can use this feature called entity roles and groups, which allows you to, in your training data, specify the role of the entity. I'm not sure if that's depending on what you're thinking
but
about.
not.
It might be what you're looking for, and it might not.
It's sort of generally similar, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely good to know about,
that
right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You can see all your options.
So hopefully that helps, giving you some ideas. Ravi says, how to create your own endpoints in another language. Are there any tutorials? Creating custom endpoints.
Meaning endpoints for what kind of service? I mean, do you mean a custom action server in a different language? Sorry, I would need some information on that one.
Yeah, we can get some. We can wait a bit. So there's a little bit, just for everyone's knowledge, there's a little bit of a delay between the time when we're speaking and when it gets projected to you, and then there's like that delay in when you give us a comment and we get a chance to read it back. So we're not ignoring you. There's just going to be a little bit of a time buffer. So yeah, if you have other information, Robbie, that would be helpful.
Yeah, otherwise, maybe just background on what endpoints are for. Endpoints, like, so for anyone who's maybe not familiar with them, is where you would basically tell the Rasa server how to communicate with other relevant services. So typically in your endpoints, you would get things like your custom action server's address. Where does it call the custom action server? Where does it call an event broker if you have one? Things like this. So yeah, the use of the endpoints depends on the fact that the Rasa server is already aware of that kind of service and what to do with it. So like an event broker, which is not required, but if it exists, it can then be called. However, if you just stuck some random service in there, it's not as if something will automatically happen to it. It will probably just be rejected as not being a type of endpoint that Rasa is familiar with.
I think it is custom actions.
Okay.
Alan's like, I guess it's custom actions, and Robbie says yes.
Okay. Yeah, so in that case, yeah, it's not that the endpoint is really custom, it's just that the custom action server is not Rasa SDK, which is totally fine. And so in the documentation, if you go to the Rasa action server page, you'll see, I think it's on its own tab right at the top, actually.
I'm zoomed too far out.
Yeah. No, so if you go up next to where it's Rasa, open source Rasa X, Rasa X, Rasa Action Server, you'll see that there's this page on all action servers that describes basically the required endpoint for your action server. Now you need to have a webhook endpoint that you build into your action server, whichever language you choose to write it in. And that webhook needs to respond with the expected format that Rasa open source needs to know about the custom action that was so that the webhook should read the information from Rasa open source correctly and respond correctly. However, you can also have that action server do a lot of other things and create as many endpoints that do other stuff for it as you'd like. If you have other services that are talking to your action server, those will not influence Rasa, but you can do that. So for example, Rasa SDK has an extra actions endpoint that just lists the actions. It's just something that you can call easily to debug stuff, really. But yeah, that wouldn't influence anything on the bot side. It would be something that it's up to you what to do with it.
Hopefully that helps, Ravi. So yes, you can absolutely create, your own action server in any language as long as Raza finds what it expects to find.
Pretty much, yeah.
More details from Deshant, who was the one who asked about forms and rules and when they contradict each other. And then we'll get to Nick's question. Form is to capture details of a user, and the form gets complete. I don't want to make a user confused, like what to type. So I want to ask anything else you want to help with, and then they said yes, and then do something.
But this is in conflict with another rule, if I'm understanding right?
Yeah, it sounds like.
I mean, that sounds like a good and straightforward use case that you could capture in a rule. Because the final rule would be that, the form is active, form deactivated, next action, ask user, what else can I help you with? That would be like, in my mind, what the rule would look like for the form's completion. I think it may be something that's easier to, for example, write up in a forum post where you can actually put your rules and what stuff's getting confused with each other. It's a lot easier to see that kind of thing in writing.
Yeah, so that might be a good thing to take to the forum. Something that I have run into myself is every so often, I'm not entirely sure what it is. I've dug into it a little bit and I've never been able to find like the underlying reason. Is the action at the end of a form won't always get triggered. And sometimes I just delete the most recent model and retrain and then it works. No idea. Again, I've been trying to figure out what it is and I haven't been able to create the problem consistently enough to hunt it down. So that might also work.
Are you sometimes using stories and rules in combination in those cases, or is it just rules?
For me?
Yeah.
So the only rule would be the form.
Wow. I have to say, I've never seen that. That's interesting.
Yeah. Actually, now that I think about it, it might have started cropping up the same version that we did incremental training.
Oh, anyway. That's interesting. But I mean, incremental training is only for NLU.
Yeah, I don't know what is causing it. And again, I can't get it happening consistently.
Terrible when you can't reproduce it, right?
Yep.
Just like, I know it doesn't always work, but I can't prove it.
So that might also work, Deshant. I don't know, give that a shot. So Nick's question that we skipped, sorry about that. How successful is the response selector on FAQs while extracting/fetching data from a CSV file or Excel file, or any new suggestions? So I think the general idea here is that you have a response selector and then you have your FAQs in like a separate thing, and then you go and get them.
Ah, I see. Honestly, my first advice would be you can fairly simply write a script that converts your CSV or Excel file into actual NLU training data. By far going to be simpler to manage because the response selector is trained on NLU data. So in the absence of finding that data in the format it expects, it's not really going to be the response selector anymore. You could hack something to have it like respond with a custom action that fetches data from the CSV, but at that point you can't really take advantage of its capabilities. So in general, when it comes to data formats, the more you can keep everything in the same format, the better, for your own sake.
Yeah. And I guess the challenge there is when your FAQs are in the format of like a question and answer section on a website, so you have one example of what the question looks like.
Right. So I mean, at that point, what you're really dealing with in it is training data collection, is not having enough examples of something of a sub intent in the response selector. And I mean, that's a fair and a fairly common situation that people have, right? They want to train their bot to recognize FAQs, but they only have the single example from website. I mean, with FAQs specifically, especially if you have, like 20 of them, if you just start out with like 5 examples of each, you can just see how well it does, and that way you can then give that to people and collect more data. That's definitely going to be
the Raza approach.
The Rasa approach, the CDD approach. Listening to your users and letting them tell you how they speak, because they say stuff that you wouldn't think they would say.
True.
All the time.
People will surprise you, often in wonderful ways.
Yeah.
Hopefully that helps. That would be our recommendation. And I know that the you need more training data answer is never a great answer to hear.
It's not nice, but it's true.
But no, that's the machine learning revolution, y'all.
Definitely one of the first things I learned about when I started learning about machine learning, and started working on a few practical problems, and that was pretty much always the first problem we ran into. We have no data for this model. Like, oh no, where will we find it?
Yep. Harris perhaps says, I'm using 2 different entities. So this was about the hierarchical entity question.
Yes.
But by definition, that doesn't make sense. So in my training data, I've specified different entities which belong to 2 different intents. Okay, so this sounds like something like if there were like, you're trying to book like a pediatric doctor visit, and you had one question that's like, what the parent's age, and one question that's like, what's the kid's age, and age is the same in both slots, but you want the entity age is the same, but you want to set it to different slots.
Right. So that, I
think, is what this is asking.
Yeah, so that does sound partially like a potentially entity role situation where you could have age being extracted with the role parent or something, and this may make more sense for that case because you might want to use duckling or something to extract the entity, in which case roles become irrelevant. It probably would be better so you could do this a few ways. You can have a custom action that checks what was the intent associated with it and then puts it in the correct slot based on that, because the entity just gets extracted by duckling. Or if it was fairly limited cases, like there's 2 or 3 options, like parent, child, whatever, you could also just put it in your stories that way, because both intents and entities together are featurized when it comes to deciding what the bot's going to do next. So that could also restrict it. I would probably go for a custom action, to be honest, that checks on that relationship. If it's in a form, that's the other thing. The kind of thing that sounds like you may want to collect it with a form, and that way you can also prompt specifically for like the parent's age or the child's age, and then you don't need to wonder because you asked. So hopefully
that helps and answers that question. All right, Lambert says, I'm working on forms in Raza 2.2.x, and I can't deactivate the form when the user intent is deny. I would use a rule for that.
No, I feel like I saw this question or a very similar one somewhere recently. I don't know if I just saw it in passing on the forum or somewhere else, but I think it situation. I'm actually going to check. Maybe I was tagged in it and that's why I remember it.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Um, so the sort of Raza 1.x approach would be to have stories with unhappy paths. So people wanting to leave the form. And I think you could still do that and that might work, but it sounds like you might have tried that and that's not working. And if you always want to immediately end the form whenever someone says no, which this might be a little bit of a big hammer for a small nail, and might catch a lot of things that are not your nail, but that might be something. It looks like Melinda's still looking up.
Yeah, I didn't see it right away, so I probably wasn't actually like tagged in it somehow then, because I would have seen it. Yeah, I mean, if it's a debugging thing where you think you already have it set up, which if it's the same kind of question, is that a case you have a rule that says that it's just not doing what you'd expect it to? The whole take one thing at a time away and see when it starts working again is often the best way to locate the locus of the problem, I guess. The other thing is you can always check on like GitHub if there is something similar reported, because if it is an issue with a specific version you're on, then the easiest way is going to be to move to the version that has a fix, if it happens to be an actual bug. I just mentioned that because I think sometimes people aren't aware that, like, yeah, how can I put it? I wasn't aware of this when I started with programming, but the way semantic versioning works means that if a bug gets fixed, it's going to be in a future version. It's not going to just get fixed in the one you're on. So it's often going to be the solution.
Yeah, so hopefully that helps, and you can check our GitHub as well, just in case it is a known issue. Bigger. Deshant says that it's none in Python. Oh yeah, we were talking about whether it was none or null with requested slot.
They're just representations of the same thing.
And Nick says, what is the major advantage of lookup? Can you briefly explain with an example? I don't think I know what lookup is.
Lookup tables. They're great. So lookup tables are basically, I would say the briefest way to understand a lookup table is to say it is a shortcut to writing absurdly long regular expressions, because that is actually exactly what a lookup table does. So sometimes people get a bit confused because the name sounds like you're going to physically, like, I don't know, scroll through an Excel sheet and look up stuff in a list, and that is implicitly what's happening because it is pattern matching everything in the list. But under the hood, it's exactly the same thing as adding a regex. It's just that you don't want to add a regex for 270 countries or whatever the case is, because that's a pain. So you provide them in a list, and then what happens to them once they've been like processed depends on the components in your pipeline. So in Rasa 2, you have two ways that regexes get used, and therefore also the same two ways that lookup tables get used. The one is by regex featurizer, and that's the same thing that was available in Rasa 1.x. And what that means is, just like you have count vectors featurizer and other featurizers that basically like provide a representation of the text of the message, it adds something to that information by saying this regex is present in this user message, and it just adds a flag. It doesn't label the flag. It doesn't say this flag means you must find this information. It's just saying here's additional patterned information that is available to you. So that's regex featurizer. And I definitely had a hard time at first understanding, like, what? When I think regex, I think you find it, you found it, that's it. But like when it comes to features, that's never quite that simple. Regex entity extractor does what you'd expect it to do, which is if it finds something that's in the regex or in the lookup table, it just extracts it. It says I found a regex or something in a lookup of the named country. I'm going to extract that as the country entity. So yeah, how the lookup table actually acts is going to depend on which of those components you're using it for, or both. But yeah.
Yeah, hopefully that helps. I assumed it was the name of an algorithm I didn't know. I was like, lookup, is this a new type of like sort or something? Oh, okay.
There's a lot of names out there.
Thank you, Melinda.
Yeah.
Hopefully that helps, Nick. Another question from Maurice. How do I reset the Raza slots once the form is submitted? I tried set slot none, but it doesn't work for custom action. What I want is that I can reset them when I have the calculation, but I'm unable to.
Right, I may need to ask for clarification here. So in general, the way you'd reset slots is that from a custom action, you'd return exactly what you've described, a slot set event that sets the slot name to null. You can also return all slots reset, which just nukes all of the values. If you want to reset the slots outside of the form's final submission method, that's fine, but it's also going to be a custom action, and you're going to need to include it in the rule or the story right after that form submission action that you wrote. I don't think I have quite enough information to understand what might not be working here. If you want to add some clarification, that's great. Otherwise, in general, though, that approach is correct.
So to clarify, if you just set the slots to none within a method and it's not returned to the Raza server, then it won't change.
No, that's not going to work.
The slot from the Raza server?
Yeah, you always need to whatever events you want the Rasa server to actually be aware of need to be returned by the custom action. It needs to be in that list of events that comes back. It can't just happen in the steps of the method.
It's a little bit asymmetric because you can fetch stuff from within the method, right, but you can't set stuff from within the method.
Yep. And that goes back to that thing we were looking at about the action server, and if you write it in any language, the input and output needs to be what Rasa expects. Rasa really does not know what your action server is doing except for what it returns. So, yeah.
Hopefully that'll be, I mean, hopefully no one's really struggling with that, but I hope that that is helpful for folks to know about. And hopefully that's what the problem is, and it's an easy fix, and it's not something more exciting.
Straightforward.
Oh. Deshant says, I added that, but it didn't work. Talking about the forms and rules and trying to, like the problem where the thing isn't happening after the form is submitted. I can check. Can you explain how other works for categorical slots, because there isn't much in the docs? Yes,
you're in luck, because I added that. Otherwise, I might also not know how it worked. It's a very small thing. So yeah, so what happens with categorical slots is so let's take a concrete example. If you have membership types, and you have gold, silver, and bronze, and this is an entity that you extract from, or it's not even an entity extract, you get it from, it is an entity extract. And you ask the user what their membership type is, and they tell you one of these things. So then there's that level of entity extraction, and then it fills the slot. And then you have this categorical slot that has gold, silver, and bronze, and you have different stories depending on which membership type the user has. But now imagine a user provides an entity with a typo, like gold E, and you haven't accounted for this in your synonyms yet, and it becomes, but it still gets extracted because Diet classifier is pretty good at extracting stuff with typos, especially if there's sufficient representation of it, and if it's sufficiently close. So now you end up with your slot filled with this value that has never been seen before. It doesn't fit into any of the categories that you have. What happens behind the scenes is that this gets featurized as that other categorical value. And what that allows is that instead of just, how can I put it? So it allows you to handle all cases where the slot is filled with something you did not expect in one way. So you could write a story to handle cases with slot filled with other, to say, can you please clarify what you meant? And if it was a typo, they can probably correct it pretty straightforwardly and say, actually, I meant blank. And then they would have a recognizable category that you could work with. So yeah, that's what other does for categorical slots. You don't have to write stories with it. If you've accounted for, if it's not, if your slot isn't getting filled by entities, so if there's no chance that it could get filled with anything else, you really don't have to worry about it because it's simply never going to happen. It's there as like a fail-safe, I guess.
Hopefully that answers your question. And I scrolled away from who asked that. Thank you for asking. Oh, it was Tashan. Thank you, Tashan. Jama says, why there are now docs for the installation for Mac OS of Raza X. Raza X seems great if it will work. So installing Raza X on Mac, is there anything special? If you have the new chip and you want to install it locally,
M1
I know
MacBooks?
that there's been some
issues.
Stuff with TensorFlow. Yeah.
Yeah, M1s and TensorFlow aren't friends at the moment, as far as I know. But short of that, I think what you might have seen in the docs is there's a mention under the quick install script that if you want to run the quick install script on a Mac or on Windows, not on Windows, on a Mac, you can use multipass, which basically gives you a little Ubuntu VM. What it comes down to is if you want to use one of these things that expects a Linux type operating system, the best bet is to find a way to fake that, be that a VM or multipass or whatever. I don't believe we've changed anything else regarding how to install Rasa X on a Mac. Like, I don't think there's any Mac native way to do it. But it is fairly straightforward to use multipass. I used to use it a lot, but I find it more convenient to use Google VMs just because then they don't use my computer's memory and stuff.
And I will say I have installed Raza X on a Mac and had a pretty straightforward experience. Windows is a little bit more involved, I would say.
Yeah.
I would recommend a virtual machine over installing locally on Windows.
My first attempt at installing Rasa X was definitely on Windows, and this was before I worked at Rasa, so it was entirely like an experiment, and it Windows gives you a hard time, especially if you have a lot of like corporate safeware on it.
I think it's very specifically some of the dependencies for TensorFlow.
Yep.
It's also a little bit rough with
Windows and machine learning in general can be a bit of a rough experience. So
yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
We do have a video on the YouTube channel about installing Raza open source on Windows, so I go through.
Yeah. Open source on Windows definitely works. That much I can say.
Yeah, and I do use Raza X on Windows locally as well.
Wow. Good accomplishment.
It just takes a bit to install because you have to deal with the dependencies, but
yeah. You mean a Docker one or?
No, I have it just like locally.
Wow. No. Nice.
All right. Other questions. The slot resetting thing doesn't work on Raza 2.2. I think these are not added in the events I got it. Thanks. Oh, okay, fantastic. So it is just like a setting it inside the method. So I think Bryce's question has been answered. I hope your project is successful. John says, I want another option. I want to add other options because we can't add more buttons for like job title. We need like machine learning engineer, dev, other, like this, so we can get other as a category. Okay, so this is an example where you're trying to set a slot. You've got entities that you know are going to be in the slot, but people add something that's not one of those entities. You want to set the value of the slot to other. Feels like a custom action to me.
Yeah, if you want the slot's value to reflect its underlying featurization, you would need a custom action to set that specifically. I will say that if that other value isn't in the list of categories, it's still going to behave the same way. So whether you manually set it to being other or whether you let it get featurized the way it will by default get featurized, it should behave the same. But I understand sometimes from a visual and just logic perspective, it can be easier to normalize stuff.
Question from Nick. If we have a JSON file format of questions and answers and use the tracker to get responses, such as the question equals tracker.latest message text, user enters the questions, will we still be able to get the response? So will users be able to, is there a way to query a JSON file where the one of them is the field and one of them is the value, and I don't remember which one. No,
key.
Is it key and value?
Yep.
Yeah, it's key and value, right?
Mm-hmm.
Key value, right? It's just like SQL. Not like SQL at all.
Nope. So I mean, you can always query a JSON file from a custom action. That's definitely the short answer. Is you can access any files you want as long as you found a way to get them in there. But what it sounds like you might actually want is an external NLG service. Now, I'm not sure if that's the case, but if you're wanting to fetch responses from somewhere else, that is a thing you can do. Rachel, I think we have in the open source docs, there's something about that would be a case of an endpoint that you can add in an external NLG service. And I've set this up before. And what that means is that that service becomes responsible for providing the actual text of the response. So you could literally have a separate Rasa model running at that external endpoint to call to get the response, or you could have some small service that is fetching data from a JSON file and returning it. That's totally an option. So this may be what you actually want, but I'm not sure.
There is a follow-up. Do we need to apply any NLP technique? What is your view on this? So
it actually sounds like something you're the one that's into the whole NLG
so it sounds like
generation stuff.
It sounds like the tricky part of this is you have the answer to a question. You want to know when people are asking that question and look it up, but you don't know that people will use the same phrasing. So this is, right? This is an NLP problem, right?
Yep.
Are these two questions equivalent? And I would probably, if it's an FAQ sort of thing, I probably would use a response selector. And you're not gonna like the answer, but for each of the questions, I would rephrase it in multiple ways in the NLU data, and then what the slot, so what the intent is identified as, the FAQ intent, that's what I would set it to, like whatever it is that you need to query the appropriate file. And yes, this does mean when you add a new question, you need to add new training data of different ways that people might ask that question. And yeah, I guess like at some point, the question is, does this need to be a conversational interface? Or is it okay if it just lives somewhere as like a big file or a list of questions that people like scroll through and click on, like sort of, traditional FAQ website things? Because you can do this using Raza, but you need to provide your guesser, basically your NLU, enough examples that it can determine, oh, these questions are equivalent, I should answer them in the same way. The more questions you have, the more examples you're going to need to give in general, just so it's easier for your system to pick things apart. And when I've gotten this question in the past, it's because people have many, 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 many questions and they don't want to do that. And I don't know how to help you. You cannot get around it.
Crowdsourcing.
That's what they're saying. You can try paraphrasing. Yeah. We use an API. I mean, if you just have, your JSON file on a server somewhere, or even like locally, you can, query it however you would.
I mean, that is exactly what an NLG server can be, right? It is an API that says go fetch it from a JSON file, but it doesn't solve the thing that Rachel was talking about, which is understanding what the user means. Like natural language understanding always requires natural language to be present somewhere. There's just no getting around that one. Yeah.
I wish I could tell you that it's easy and solved, but it is not. Will it return the original long answers, such as 5 or 10 lines? Oh, if you just have a really long answer, that should be fine.
Yeah.
it may be like rough to read in a little chat box, but it depends on how you're serving it to users.
Right.
Can we do as an intent as question and domain as response? What's the same difference? Yeah, so it'll be the responses. The response selector is for intents, right? So each of the things that you are responding to is responding to an intent, and the intent is going to be, the question or the sort of like chit chat turn or whatever it is that you're always going to want to give the same response to, basically. Yeah. Robbie says use the Azure API for different to task, then no need to create your own model. I don't think I've used the.
Is that like an API to an external NLP model that is already going to give you?
Yeah, I don't know.
Because I mean, that's also a thing. You can also add, so that's also a separate docs page. You can also add an external NLU server. That's also an option. So if you already have a source of a model that can understand stuff for you, basically, parse messages for you, you can call that as well. So
NLU server.
Yep,
there
that
we go.
one.
NLU only server. Yeah. Yep.
And it's the same deal as the action server. It's the same deal as the NLG server, where Rasa just needs to get back the expected response. And other than that, you can do whatever you want on the other side. And if it's a predefined service by Azure, that's cool.
Yeah, I hope that helps. John says the entity doesn't detect other as a slot value. Oh, like the word other? Well, you could add that as an entity.
Yeah.
You could extract that.
You mean you need to annotate it enough times, but you could. No, nothing's stopping that.
Yeah. You might even, it sounds like a situation where, I don't remember if you mentioned that this was buttons, but I might use buttons here.
Yeah, if it's buttons, you can just hard code the value to other, and then it's fine. You don't have to worry about it. Because I mean, it's highly unlikely that your users are going to say, I have a, like they're going to use the word other in that sense. I don't know that that's ever going to happen, but
if you
depends what you're asking them, I guess.
And it depends also, like I can imagine people putting like mother as career. Sometimes you'll see that in survey responses. So if you have like a very sensitive character level model, you might get
that would also be awkward, yeah.
Yeah, that I don't know how common that is in your particular use case.
You can also have like a follow-up thing, right? Where you can have a button that says, if you give them 5 options and the last one is other, then it'll pre-populate the slot with other, but then you could ask a follow-up question. Like again, if this was like a 2-question form, the follow-up question could fill a slot from text, and it could be maybe just like a slot that you specifically use to gather new careers your participants want to give you, and then you can use that eventually to like add to your NLU model. So that's actually something I've seen done with, for example, like problem descriptions, where you ask what kind of, if it's a IT helpline, like what kind of problem are you running into? And if it's not one of the options that they provide, you populate a new slot with that new problem so that you can get a human later to look at it and be like, they run into this issue that we don't have a automatic handling for yet.
Yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Well, it gives you another idea for an approach.
Sorry, yeah. May not be relevant in this case, just something I thought of.
Nick says, thank Rachel and Melinda for the questions. I hope you didn't give a hard time. No, not at all. And it's a little bit lossy to like try and talk through chat to get a sense of what your questions are. So I'll update the progress on the forum or to the team. Yeah, please do. Be interested to hear. And I just want to circle back to something, because FAQs, and especially like situations where there's a lot of FAQs, I think are super common use for conversational AI and Raza in particular, and I get a lot of questions about it. And just to like zoom way out, my question to you, the person who is building the FAQ bot is, how do you know that the Q is F, right? How do you know that the question is frequently asked?
That's a very good point.
Because if that's coming from text data, right? Like if it's like somebody's getting emailed a lot with this question and you have permission to use the data, in, other applications, then there's your training data, right? You can just take those examples and it's gonna be work. Like it's gonna take some time, budget time for it, but you can take those examples of user generated text and use those to generate your system. And the other thing is, if you do have a good like representation of what questions are asked, you will almost certainly find that there is a really fast decay function in frequency of asking, right? So my experience in customer service and being in the world and also being a linguist is that, 5 to 10 questions, maybe if it's something where you do have a lot of diversity in your questions, will be asked the majority of the time, and then you'll get a drop off. So a lot of the questions that are frequently asked maybe only get liked, 1 out of 100 questions will be this particular question. And, if you have a situation for handling the questions in the first place, even just having a system that can handle, 50% of the questions that are very frequently asked, that you can be you have lots of training examples for, and that it's pretty easy to pick out because you have so many training examples, and then passing somebody on to a person, if they're in that sort of long tail, like that's progress. That'll make somebody's life better.
Yeah. Or you can have a fallback that sends someone to a list of questions. So like,
yeah, absolutely.
Sarah, who lived on the docks and will at some point live on the docks again, the Sarah bot, if you ask a technical question, there's a couple that she'll respond to, like, how do I install stuff? And she'll actually step you through how to install stuff. But most technical questions go in one common bucket because we can't have handling for each of them separately. And then it will do an automatic search of the forum, for example. So you can also make use of what we call like deep integrations to like improve the user's experience without having to get a super complicated NLU model for which you don't have enough examples per category. So just as another way of handling something like that.
Yeah. Anyway, just sort of my 2 cents on the UP. I missed. You should be able to go back and watch it. The recordings are always available immediately after, and then the chat will show up usually like a couple hours after because the chat takes longer to process. But yeah. Yeah, and Nick says we have historical data to support our live team. Yeah. Also, if you have like you're working with customer support agents, like they are experts. Let them help you. They're gonna know like what the questions are that they want to be able to handle automatically. They'll be like, oh yeah, 80% of people, and that particular number actually comes from my previous experience. 80% of questions were the same question, and if we'd had a system that could handle one question, it would have made our customer support person's life infinitely easier. So, yeah.
What's that called? Zip's law, right? The whole
yes,
situation.
Yep.
Incredibly widely applicable. Like amazing.
Pop this over here. Yeah, this one. Zipsol. Although in linguistics, usually we talk about it on like the token level and not the speech act level.
But the concept is applicable to many situations besides
Yep.
just the token level. So. Yep.
If there are many possible events, most of them will be rare.
Right, exactly. Same thing with vocabulary. Most of us use like 1,000 words or something, but we know like 8,000 or something like this.
But if you count the individual number of words that a person used in a day, like many of them would only have been used once.
Right.
For example, now I'm going to say zip a bunch of times. But if we just mentioned it passing in conversation, we would have said it once. Here. All right. Other questions? That's not English. I'm not going to try reading a language when I don't know what it is. No one's going to enjoy that. All right. So, looks like we're waiting on more questions and people have them. Yeah. Nick says, that's what I want. Happy to support my support team and ask those questions to you. Yeah, no, we're happy to answer the questions. But like, I don't know. I don't know what the most frequent question is, and those folks will. So my question for you, Melinda, while we're waiting for another one to come in, I've been really enjoying asking people this lately. What is the best or worst chatbot you've ever used?
Oof. I don't want to mention names.
If it's the worst, I would just be like, I was using a thing for a purpose.
I was using a chatbot to try to sort out a cell phone contract, and this was in Germany. And I will say that as a general rule, the front end of German websites leave something to be desired. Not universally true, but on average. And it could not, it did not have a fallback function. That's what it came down to. And it wanted my birth date, and it did not tell me what format it wanted my birth date in. And I tried really hard to give it what it wanted, but I couldn't figure it out. And it just kept asking, like infinity, asking for my birth date. So I could never get past that point. And I used that thing that you realize, like, but all chatbots must have a thing that you can do to trigger something. So eventually I informed it strongly of how angry I was with it. And I was then told, oh, I am redirecting you to a customer service agent. It's like, I see, I found the fallback button. But man, that thing needed some help.
Yeah, that's rough.
Do you have a favorite chatbot, Rachel?
Ooh, I in terms of just like making my life better, I used a chatbot to book time off that was so good, so good. This wasn't a Raza, it was a different company.
Nice.
That was very large, very hard to like find the thing that you needed to do and like the exact, correct form. And it was a very global company as well. So the answer to somebody in like South Africa, for example, was going to be different for the answer for somebody in California. And it was just so smooth. It's lovely.
That's awesome.
Question from Deshant. Can you suggest 3 good universities for an AI degree in a master?
I really think you could that one, Rachel, because I didn't really do that. But
I'm going to not answer the question. I mean, there are lots of good places to study machine learning if that's what you're interested in. Would I recommend University of Washington? University of Washington has a computational linguistics master's program that I think is quite good.
I did remember looking into that one and being super impressed with everything I found. That I will say.
Yeah, it's a good program. If you're interested specifically in NLP, there's also, I think Georgia Tech has a master's maybe in NLP. Lots of good people at Georgia Tech. But in general, understanding that my cultural situation may be different from your cultural situation, I don't, in general, for almost everybody, recommend graduate school. It is very expensive, particularly in the United States. And in addition to sort of like the money expense, you are also, giving up working years of your life when you could be earning salary because presumably you're doing it professional reasons. So I would say if this really is the yourself and your learning style, and the only way that you're going to be able to keep with studies and continue to learn something is if you have that structure, and if it's really important to you to have sort of a built-in social network, it could be worth it for you. But in general, and particularly in machine learning, because things move so quickly, that I wouldn't necessarily recommend getting a degree in like neural anything, just because by the time you're out of the program, the things that you learned are probably going to be out of date. Yeah, I might even recommend like a statistics program over fancy neural networks. We're only going to teach you transformers. And then in 2 years, when that's no longer the hot architecture, you will have a hard time applying those skills that you spent a lot of time learning. So I went to grad school. I had a good time. I wouldn't recommend it for pretty much anybody. And that's my spiel. And that is my usual, I will say, I tell everybody who asks me that. Yeah.
Well, I'm one example, happily employed in NLP and did not go to graduate school. So I did study it a little bit in a like certificate type program, but I did not do a master's in it. And I considered it, but I'm actually I actually considered and was accepted to a master's program that I was very strongly considering, and I actually chose to take employment instead. And I'm very glad I did, because I think I like to learn practically, and so for me, employment is way better because you can, you're really like solving problems while learning concepts.
And then there's a question: if I'm taking PhD students, I am not a professor. And then I think one last question, because we're right at time, from Tanpui says, when will Raza 2 support the Apple M1 CPU plus TensorFlow 2.4? I think that's my understanding of the issues, and I will say I do not have this chip, so I've not run into them myself, is that I don't think that would be necessarily something on our end. It seems like more a TensorFlow issue. Is my understanding. So it'll be
that is what I've seen as well from everyone, is the issue is going to be the dependencies. And as soon as all the dependencies are supported, and Rasa upgrades to the most recent dependencies pretty much as soon as it can, then Rasa would also by extension be supported.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I don't think that's really in our control.
I have to wonder why they did that. Why did they build a chip that... They must have their reasons, but man.
Presumably.
Yeah.
I mean, if I had to guess, I would say that supporting TensorFlow is not a priority for Apple engineers.
But it should be.
Yeah, and on that great note, thank you so much for joining today, everybody. Thank you, Melinda, for being here. If you have any other questions, bring them to the forum address down there. And we will, Melinda won't be back. I'll be back tomorrow with a paper reading group. And I've gotten a lot of questions recently about knowledge bases. So actually the paper is going to be one of the task papers from a recent workshop at AAAI on integrating knowledge bases with conversational AI and task-oriented dialogue systems. So I'm excited to learn. Hopefully y'all will learn. And then on Friday for live coding, we'll be doing a bug hunt for the problem that we ran into last time. I have faith that we'll fix it eventually. I don't know that it's going to take an hour, but it might. Who knows? Yeah, so that's the schedule. I'll see you then, and Melinda will see you in the future, perhaps.
On the forum.
On the forums, for sure. All right.